Hello and welcome to my video. This is all about the shadow arc, which is described in British Standard 5837. It first appeared in the 2005 version and is now in the 2012, which is the latest release. And it describes it as a radius from the centre of the stem equal to the height of the tree, drawn from north west to due east. And it indicates the shadow pattern through the main part of the day. So what I'm going to do, I'll first describe exactly what this represents and how it should be used, and then show how to draw it on AutoCAD, which isn't particularly difficult, but we will turn it into a dynamic block to make it easier to use for different trees with different tree heights. So it says it's got to be drawn with a radius equal to the height of the tree. So I'll just zoom down here. So if the tree is 10 meters tall, then these lengths are 10 meters, and the angle will always be 135 degrees, because from northwest to due east is 135 degrees. You've got 90 from east to north plus 45. And I've put it on this sort of little drawing here to show you the sort of sun's motion. So we're looking down on the tree. The tree is in the centre. The sun sort of rises in the east. Sometimes it's in the northeast, depending on the time of year. And then it rotates through our southern skies when looking at it from the tree's perspective and sets in the west. So the shadow does the opposite. It runs from west to east. Now this very crude illustration doesn't take into account the shadow length, because early in the morning it's going to be really long, and then it gets shorter and shorter as the sun rises in altitude, and then it starts to drop, so the shadow gets longer again. But it just sort of shows how this segment works as a sort of template over the tree. And the sun's altitude is its angle from the local area you're standing and its height in the sky. So for London, June the 21st at solar noon, which is the highest point the sun reaches in the year, it'd be about 61 degrees. And the shadow are quite short. In the winter, in the winter solstice, where the sun reaches its lowest point in the sky height, forenoon, solar noon, the angle is much smaller, which means its altitude is much smaller and the shadow lengths are much longer. So going back to our British Standard, where it says the height of the tree, so if the tree is 10 meters high and the shadow length is 10 meters, then going down to our little diagram here, the elevation, the altitude of the sun must be 45 degrees, because if the height is 10 meters and the shadow length is 10 meters, then it must be 45 degrees altitude. And now I'm going to go across to this sun path indicator. I found this in British Standard 8206 Part 2 1992. This is for London. BS5837, I think this has now been superseded and superseded again. I think it's been superseded twice, and I don't think you can get these diagrams anymore because they replaced all the manual calculations, because this is designed for sort of manual work. But it's really a great little diagram, because he's mixed the sort of map position with all these angles around the outside with the solar altitude, and then he's plotted the sun paths for different times of the year with hours of the day, which means you can work out for a particular day of the year the sun's altitude and the time it'll reach that altitude, etc. It's really quite useful. I've redrawn it so it's a bit clearer. So the pink magenta lines are the sun's path. We're in the northern hemisphere, so the sun moves in the southern sky. If you're in Australia, then it'll be completely opposite and the sun will be moving in the northern sky. And the times of day, and this is all sort of based on solar noon. It doesn't, include BST. And then you've got the solar altitude. So I plotted a little green circle here, which is 45 degrees, because we know we must be using 45 degrees because the height and the shadow length are the same. So using this, we can work out which times of day and days of the year this shadow arc covers, and they'll be inside this green circle. I'm going to plop this on there because it will make it a bit easier. So there's my shadow arc, and the tree will be in the centre, and I've extended these lines across so we can see which parts of the sun paths it includes. So it's from this red line and within this green circle up to this red line. So with this in mind, we can say that from April, probably around April the 10th, somewhere around there, to maybe just the end of August, possibly the 1st of September, is when the shading for this circle starts. It's just in there, it only lasts 2 hours. And time wise, roughly starts at 10 AM, because that's a bit after, that's a bit before. We're not touching these, we're not interested in March to December, and ends, well, it actually ends about 3:10, because this section here, there's no sun in that section. The sun isn't at that altitude, it's dropped below it. So I would say, going back to the British Standard, it represents the approximate shadow movement from late AM to late PM for the period mid-April to late August. That would be my description of what it actually shows. And if I just get a line onto this centre, onto there, and I'll just extend that, and it's going to make life difficult for me because it's got the quick setting on this later version of AutoCAD. So I'll just keep going a bit more. So in reality, because there's no shadow path within the 45 degrees past 3:10, the actual arc should end at this red line, but that would be difficult to draw. So this section here doesn't really apply at this solar altitude, but the red line is there, so it is saying it includes all this. So in a sense, we could redraw this slightly. If I was to go from there to there, because this April-August pink line is touched by the 45 degrees, if I follow it up to here, back to here, and convert this into an arc, it should really look like this. It should be a really elongated segment coming back to cover this area, because that's what they're actually saying time wise this covers. But because we've got the 45 degrees, it doesn't. It should actually be this shorter segment. So this is a compromise. It's a juggling act between showing altitude and times, and it's not a bad compromise, but it is that, and it's a sort of very rough idea, and it should be seen as that. So with that in mind, I've added some more text to my sort of enhanced description. Showing the movement of the shadow from west to east, and is an area which will experience shade but is unlikely to be completely shaded all day. Because if we go back to this, the segment shows the movement of the shadow, and if your shadow is really thin, because it's a very thin tree, it's just going to go across the site and won't necessarily be a problem. A big huge crown may well, you know, cover a good proportion of this as it moves, but it can't be seen as an area that's shaded necessarily all day. It's showing the movement of the shadow across the site, across the segment. And it's important to sort of understand that and not automatically assume that a segment represents a shaded area all day. So this is what I would have sort of used to replace the BS description, where it says indicating the shadow pattern through the main part of the day. I would say it represents the approximate shadow movement from late AM to late PM for the period mid-April to late August, shows the movement of the shadow from west to east, and is an area which will experience shade but is unlikely to be completely shaded all day. If you're going to sort of put your segments on a drawing and put a description in your key, then you know, it's up to you how you describe it. You can just stick the BS description, the British Standard I should say, not BS. It's got a double meaning there, but yeah, feel free to use these, but you know, use them at your own risk. I'm not going to be liable for anything. So now I'm going to describe how to draw it. I'm going to start by making a layer. I'll call it Arb Shadow. And just give it a blue colour. And default line weight. And I'll make that the current layer. So I'll do it for a 10 metre tree, because we're going to use this in a dynamic block, and that's a good sort of size to see when you start with it. Plot a circle wherever you like, put in 10, so it's a 10 metre radius circle, and then polyline from the centre of the circle to the 3 o'clock quadrant, which is, these are the quadrants, so there, If you haven't got the snap settings there, you can always just right click and select from the override. So you just click center or quadrant or whatever. Quadrant, there it is. Get rid of him. And then I'm going to take this line and I'm going to rotate it around the center of the circle. But I'm going to make a copy. So I'm going to click copy down here. Or you can right click copy. And the angle we want is 135 degrees because it's 90 plus 45 to go northwest. So I'm just going to type in 135. Because remember, AutoCAD by default, their angles go anti-clockwise. If you find that your line ended up down here, that would be because if I type units, you would have this set to clockwise, which means your angles go clockwise. And in that case, if you are using clockwise angles, then you would put in minus 135 instead of 135. And then I'm going to use trim. If you're using 2021 or 2022 AutoCAD, then you've only got to mouse over the bits and it will trim them. So you just mouse over and it's trimmed it off. But if you are using the earlier AutoCADs, then you haven't got these options. You will be on standard. So when you go trim, it asks you to select objects and you select the two lines. Right click and then remove the bit. And now I'm just going to select all three items and type in join, and it's turned it into a single polyline which is closed. And that is our 10 meter segment. And I'm going to turn that into a dynamic block, because if you've got 50 to 100 trees on your drawing, you don't want to be going through that process every time. So I'm going to copy it with a base point here, which is the center of the tree, and then I'm going to deselect everything and create a block and call it Arb shadow. And we'll have that in meters. Open in block editor, allow to be exploded. Okay, it will say you haven't got any objects. That's fine, continue. And then I'm going to paste to 0, 0. And there's my line. So I want to make this adjustable and scalable automatically, so I'm going to make a parameter, a linear parameter. I'm going to put it on here, pull it down there a bit, select it and give it a name, and it'll be tree height, because that's the value I need to put in, tree height. And I don't want to show this grip. I don't want it to be pullable that way because it'll pull it off the tree center. So I'm just going to say one grip, so only this one is pullable, and then hit escape. And this little warning thing is telling me that no actions are associated with it, which means nothing can happen until we make an action. So I'm going to choose scale, and it's asking me for the parameter, so I click that, and then it wants the objects, which is the polyline. Click that, right click because I don't need any more, and it's all sorted out. So if I test it, click test block and select it, you can see I've got tree height down here with a value in. I can grab this and do it manually, or I can enter the value in. So if it's 12 meters high, if it's 6 meters high, or even 1 meter high, it will scale the segment. And close the test block and close the block editor, save the changes. So if I now insert a block, sorry, rather a lot here, there he is. And it scaled it. And I think the reason it scaled it is because it's inserting with inches. This setting is for sort of blocks, whether you want them scaled, so you need to set that to meters. So if I now insert again, it hasn't scaled it, it's correct now. Tree height is 10. So all you'd need to do is plot this on top of your tree center, enter the tree height, and it will scale it accordingly. Now in a previous video we created a dynamic tree block which allowed us to set the canopy sizes, the root protection area, the tag and the category color. So I'm going to add this to that, but unfortunately you can't combine dynamic blocks together and copy over the parameters. So I'm going to redraw it. So this is a separate block called Arb Shadow. I'm going to open a drawing that I've got the dynamic block on for the tree, and I'm just going to copy that. And place it on here. And the original 10 meter polyline we created before we turned it into a block, I'm just going to copy that with the base point there, and then right click, block editor, and clipboard paste to the center of the tree. And I'm going to send that to the back, so it's behind the category icon. So that's the polyline, it's got the right layer name. So I'm going to add a parameter again, a linear, just like before. I'll bring that down there so it's out of the way. Select that. I'll call that tree height, and I just want one grip. Hit escape, and action, scale, parameter, object is the shadow, right click, and I'll just test it. So I can change my canopies, my RPA, and my shadow. And I can change the tree height here. It's added it to the properties. So if I put in 8 meters high, it adjusts it nicely. So I'll close test block, close the tree block, and when we built this we had the visibility states set up for the categories. and I believe we need to update the shadow. I'll show you why. I'll close this, save the changes. There's our block. So if I change the category to A, my shadow disappears. B, it disappears. C, disappears on all of them except for none. So I need to update the layer states, the display states. So I'll go into the block editor again. So for none, it's visible. For A, it disappears. Well, I want it to be visible. So I'll click visible. For B, I want it to be visible. And C, I want it to be visible. And for U, you can decide whether or not you want to show it. If U is a tree to be removed, you wouldn't normally want to show the shadow. So I think I'll leave that as it is, so it's hidden. But if you want to show it, then simply click it, but I won't. So I'll close that and save the changes. So now if I change my categories to A, it shows, B it shows, C it shows, and as I'm clicking these categories, the center color is changing, and if I select U, it disappears. And none is the default. We let it show, and the category color is a sort of purple to say you haven't selected a category. And that's it. And if you're doing this block, I would just suggest you copy it, stick it on its own drawing, sort of, you know, have a drawing for all your bits and pieces, your aids and your things to copy to other drawings, and then you can keep it updated. So that's the end of the video, I do believe. I hope it was some use, and see you on the next video.